Welcome to the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, chapters 22 through 24. We start right after Sherburne has shot Boggs in the street and they're all going off to lynch Sherburne. They swarmed up the street toward Sherburne's house, a-whooping and a-yelling and raging like Injuns, and everything had to clear the way or get run over and tromped to mush, and it was awful to see. Children was heeling in ahead of the mob, screaming and trying to get out of the way, and every window along the row was full of women's heads, and there was N-word boys in every tree, and bucks and wenches looking over every fence, and as soon as the mob would get nearly to them, they would break and scuttle back out of reach. Lots of the women and girls was crying and taking on, scared most to death. They swarmed up in front of Sherburne's palings as thick as they could jam together, and you couldn't hear yourself think for the noise. It was a little 20-foot yard. Some sung out, "Tear down the fence! Tear down the fence!" Then there was a racket of ripping and tearing and smashing, and down she goes, and the front wall of the crowd begins to roll in like a wave. Just then, Sherburne steps out onto the roof of his little front porch with a double-barreled gun in his hand and takes his stand, perfectly calm and deliberate, not saying a word. The racket stopped, and the wave sucked back. Sherburne never said a word, just stood there, looking down. The stillness was awful creepy and uncomfortable. Sherburne run his eye slow along the crowd and wherever it struck, and people tried a little to outgaze him, but they couldn't. They dropped their eyes and looked sneaky. Then pretty soon Sherburne sort of laughed, not the pleasant kind, but the kind that makes you feel like when you're eating bread that's got sand in it. Then he says, slow and scornful, "The idea of you lynching anybody, it's amusing. The idea of you thinking you had pluck enough to lynch a man because you're brave enough to tar and feather poor friendless cast-out woman that come along here. Did that make you think you had grit enough to lay your hands on a man? Why, a man's safe in the hands of 10,000 of your kind, as long as it's daytime and you're not behind him. Do I know you? I know you clear through. I was born and raised in the South, and I've lived in the North, so I know the average all around. The average man's a coward. In the North, he lets anybody walk over him that wants to and goes home and prays for a humble spirit to bear it. In the South, one man all by himself has stopped a stage full of men in the daytime and robbed a lot. Your newspapers call you a brave people so much that you think you are braver than any other people, whereas you're just as brave and no braver. Why don't your juries hang murderers? Because they're afraid the man's friends will shoot them in the back, in the dark. And that's just what they would do. So there's your answer to number one about the difference between the North and the South and the people in it. So they always acquit, means let the guy go, let the murderer off. And then a man goes in the night with 100 masked cowards at his back and lynches the rascal. Your mistake is that you didn't bring a man with you. That's one mistake. And the other is you didn't come in the dark and fetch your masks. You brought part of a man, Buck Harkness there, and if you hadn't had him to start you, you'd have taken it out and blowing. You didn't want to come. The average man don't like trouble and danger. You don't like trouble and danger. But if only half a man, like Buck Harkness there, shouts, lynch him, you're afraid to back down, afraid you'll be found out to be what you are, cowards. And so you raise a yell and hang yourselves onto that half a man's coattail and come raging up here, swearing what big things you're going to do. The pitifulest thing out is a mob. That's what an army is, a mob. They don't fight with the courage that's born in them, but with the courage that's borrowed from their mass and from their officers. But a mob without any man at the head of it is beneath pitifulness. Now the thing for you to do is droop your tails and go home and crawl in a hole. If any real lynching's going to be done, it'll be done in the dark, Southern fashion. And when they come, they'll bring their masks and fetch a man along. Now leave. And take your half a man with you, tossing his gun up across his left arm and cocking it when he says this. There's the answer to number two. The crowd washed back sudden and then broke all apart and went tearing off every which way, and Buck Harkness, he heeled it after him, looking tolerable cheap. I could have stayed if I'd have wanted to, but I didn't want to. I went to the circus and loafed around the backside till the watchman went by, and then dived in under the tent. I had my $20 gold piece and some other money, but I reckon I better save it, because they ain't no telling how soon you're going to need it away from home and amongst strangers that way. You can't be too careful. I ain't opposed to spending money on circuses when there ain't no other way, but there ain't no use in wasting it on them. It was a real bully circus. It was the splendidest sight that ever was when they all come riding in two and two, a gentleman and lady side by side, the men just in their drawers and undershirts, no shoes nor stirrups, and resting their hands on their thighs, easy and comfortable. There must have been 20 of them. And every lady with a lovely complexion and perfectly beautiful and looking just like a gang of real sure enough queens and dressed in clothes that cost millions of dollars, just littered with diamonds. It was a powerful, fine sight. I never seen anything so lovely. And then one by one, they got up and stood and went a-weaving around the ring, so gentle, so wavy and graceful, the men looking ever so tall and airy and straight, with their heads bobbing and skimming along, away up there under the tent roof, and every lady's rose-leafy dress flapping soft and silky around her hips, and she looking like the most loveliest parasol. And then faster and faster they went, all of them dancing. First one foot stuck out in the air and then the other, and the horses leaning more and more, and the ringmaster going around and around the center pole, cracking his whip and shouting, "Hi, hi!" And the clown cracking jokes behind him, and by all hands dropped the reins, and every lady put her knuckles on her hips, and every gentleman folded his arms, and then how the horses did lean over and hump themselves, and buck their back ends up. And so, one after the other, they all skipped off into the ring and made the sweetest bow I ever see, and then scampered out, and everybody clapped their hands and went just about wild. Well, all through the circus, they done the most astonishing things, and all the time, that clown carried on, so it most killed the people. The ringmaster could never say a word to him, but he was back at him quick as a wink with the funniest things a body ever said. And how he ever could think of so many of them, and so sudden and so pat, was what I couldn't no way understand. Well, I couldn't have thought him in a year. And by and by, a drunk man tried to get into the ring, said he wanted to ride, said he could ride as well as anybody that ever was. They argued and tried to keep him out, but he wouldn't listen, and the whole show come to a standstill. Then the people began to holler at him and make fun of him, and that made him mad, and he began to rip and tear. So that stirred up the people, and a lot of men began to pile down off the benches and swarm towards the ring, saying, "Knock him down, throw him out." And one or two women began to scream. So then the ringmaster, he made a little speech and said he hoped there wouldn't be no disturbance. If the man would promise he wouldn't make no more trouble, he would let him ride, if he thought he could stay on the horse. So everybody laughed and said, "All right," and the man got on. The minute he was on, the horse begun to rip and tear and jump and cavort around, with two circus men hanging onto his bridle trying to hold him, and the drunk man hanging onto his neck, and his heels flying up in the air every jump, and the whole crowd of people standing up shouting and laughing until the tears rolled down. And at last, sure enough, all the circus men could do, the horse broke loose, and away he went like the very nation, round and round the ring, with that sot, drunk guy, laying down on him and hanging to his neck, with first one leg hanging most of the ground to one side, and then to other one on the other side, and people went just crazy. It weren't funny to me, though. I was all in a tremble to see his danger, is the answer to number 3. But pretty soon, he struggled up a straddle and grabbed the bridle, a-reeling this way and that, and the next minute he sprung up and dropped the bridle and stood. And the horse a-going like a house afire, too. He just stood up there, sailing around as easy and comfortable as if he weren't ever drunk in his life. And then he begun to pull off his clothes and fling them. He shed them so thick, they kind of clogged up the air, and altogether, he shed 17 suits. And then there he was, slim and handsome, and dressed the gaudiest and prettiest you ever saw, and he lit into that horse with his whip and made him fairly hum, and finally skipped off and made his bow and danced off to the dressing room, and everybody just a-howling with pleasure and astonishment. Then the ringmaster, he see how he had been fooled, and he was the sickest ringmaster you ever see, I reckon. Why, I was one of his own men. He had got up that joke all out of his own head and never let on to nobody. Well, I felt sheepish enough to be took in so, but I wouldn't have been in that ringmaster's place, not for $1,000. I don't know. There may be bullier circuses than what that one was, but I never struck them yet. Anyways, it was plenty good enough for me. And whenever I run across it, it can have all my custom every time. So there's number 4. Well, that night we had our show, but there weren't only about 12 people there, just enough to pay expenses. And they laughed all the time, and that made the Duke mad, and everybody left anyway before the show was over, but one boy, which was asleep. There's number 5. So the Duke said these Arkansas lunkheads couldn't come up to Shakespeare. What they wanted was low comedy, and maybe something rather worse than low comedy, he reckoned. He said he could size their style. So next morning, he got some big sheets of wrapping paper and some black paint and drawed off some handbills and stuck them up all over the village. The bill said, "At the courthouse for 3 nights only, the world-renowned tragedians David Garrick the Younger and Edmund Kean the Elder of the London and Continental Theaters in their thrilling tragedy of The King's Camelopard or The Royal Nonsuch. Admission, 50 cents. Then at the bottom was the biggest line of all, which said, "Ladies and children not admitted." There, says he. If that line don't fetch him, I don't know Arkansas. And there is number 6 and the end of chapter 22. Chapter 23. Well, all day him and the Duke was hard at it, rigging up a stage and a curtain and a row of candles for footlights. And all that, and that night, the house was jam full of men in no time. When the place couldn't hold on no more, the Duke, he quit tending door and went around the back way and come onto the stage and stood before the curtain and made a little speech and praised up this tragedy and said it was the most thrillingest one that ever was. And so he went on bragging about the tragedy and about Edmund Kean the Elder, which was to play the main principal part in it. And at last, when he got up everyone's expectations up high enough, he rolled up the curtains, and the next minute the king come a prancing out on all fours, naked, and he was painted all over, ring-streaked and striped, all sorts of colors, as splendid as a rainbow. But never mind the rest of his outfit, it was just wild, but it was awful funny. The people most killed themselves laughing, and the king got done capering. He capered off behind the scenes. Then they roared and clapped and stormed and ha-ha till he come back and done it over again. And after that, they made him do it another time. Well, it would have made a cow laugh to see the shines that old idiot cut. Then the Duke, he lets the curtain down and bows to the people and says the great tragedy will be performed only 2 nights more on accounts of press and London engagements, where the seats is all sold already for it in Drury Lane. And then he makes them another bow and says if he has succeeded in pleasing them and instructing them, he will be deeply obliged if they will mention it to their friends and get them to come and see it. 20 people sings out, "What, is it over? Is that all?" The Duke says yes. Then there was a fine time. Everybody sings out, "Sold!" We got ripped off. And rose up mad and was a-going for that stage, and then tragedy ends. But a big, fine-looking young man jumps up on a bench and shouts, "Hold on, just a word, gentlemen." They stop to listen. "We are sold, mighty badly sold. But we don't want to be the laughingstock of this whole town, I reckon, and never hear the last of this thing as long as we live. No, what we want is to go out of here quiet and talk this show up and sell the rest of the town. Then we'll all be in the same boat. Ain't that sensible?" "You bet it is. The judge is right," everybody sings out. "All right then, not a word about any sell. Go along home and advise everybody to come and see the tragedy." And there's the answer to number 7 about the crowd's reaction. Next day, you couldn't hear nothing around that town but how splendid that show was. House was jammed again that night, and we sold this crowd the same way. When me and the king and the Duke got home to the raft, we all had a supper, and by, about midnight, they made Jim and me back her out and float her down the middle of the river and fetch her in and hide her about 2 miles below town. The third night, the house was crammed again, and they weren't newcomers this time, but people that was at the show the other 2 nights. I stood by the Duke at the door, and I see that every man that went in had his pockets bulging or something muffled up under his coat. And I see it weren't no perfumery neither, not by a long sight. I smelt sickly eggs by the barrel and rotten cabbages and such things. And if I know the signs of a dead cat being around, and I bet I do, there were 64 of them that went in. I shoved in there for a minute, but it was too smelly for me. I couldn't handle it. Well, when the place couldn't hold no more people, the Duke, he gave a fellow a quarter and told him to tend door for him a minute, and then he started around for the stage door. I after him, but the minute we turned the corner and was in the dark, he says, "Walk fast now till you get away from the houses, then shin for the raft like the Dickens was after you." I done it, and he done the same. We struck the raft at the same time, and in less than 2 seconds, we was gliding downstream, all dark and still, and edging toward the middle of the river, nobody saying a word. I reckon the poor king was in for a gaudy time of it with the audience, but nothing of the sort. Pretty soon he crawls out from under the wigwam and says, "Well, how'd the old thing pan out this time, Duke?" He hadn't been up in town at all. We never showed a light till we was about 10 miles below that village. Then we lit up and had a supper, and the king and the Duke fairly laughed their bones loose over the way they'd served them people. The Duke says, "Greenhorns, flatheads. I know the first house would keep mum and let the rest of the town get roped in, and I knew they'd lay for us the third night and consider it was their turn now. Well, it is their turn, and I'd give something to know how much they'd take for it. I would just like to know how they're putting in their opportunity. They can turn it into a picnic if they want. They brought plenty of provisions." Them rapscallions took in $465 in that 3 nights. I never seen money hauled in by the wagon load like that before. So there is number 8, about the end of the con of the Royal Nonsuch. By and by, when they was asleep and snoring, Jim says, "Don't it surprise you the way them kings carries on, Huck?" "No," I says, "it don't." "Why don't it, Huck?" "Well, it don't because it's in the breed. I reckon they're all alike." "But Huck, These kings aren't as regular rapscallions. That's just what they is. They's regular rapscallions. Well, that's what I'm saying. All kings is mostly rapscallions, as far as I can make out. Is that so? You read about him once, you'll see. Look at Henry VIII. This is a Sunday school superintendent to him. And look at Charles II and Louis XIV and Louis XV and James II and Edward II and Richard III and 40 more. Besides all them Saxon heptarchies that used to rip around Seoul in the old times and raise Cain. My, you ought to see an old Henry VIII when he was in bloom. He was a blossom. He used to marry a new wife every day and chop off her head the next morning. And he would do it as indifferent as if he was ordering up eggs. Fetch up Nell Gwynn, he says. They fetch her up. Next morning, chop off her head, and they chop it off. Fetch up Jane Shore, he says. Up she comes. Next morning, chop off her head, and they chop it off. Ring up Fair Rosamond. Fair Rosamond answers the bell. Next morning, chop off her head. And he made every one of them tell him a tale every night, and he kept that up till he had hogged 1,001 tales that way, and then he put them all in a book and called it a Doomsday Book, which is a good name, and started the case. You don't know kings, Jim, but I know them. And this old rip-iron is one of the cleanest I've struck in history. Well, Henry, he takes a notion he wants to get up some trouble with this country. How does he go at it? Give notice? Give the country a show? No. All of a sudden, he heaves all the tea in Boston Harbor overboard and whacks out a Declaration of Independence and dares them to come on. That was his style. He never gave anybody a chance. He had suspicions of his father, the Duke of Wellington. Well, what did he do? Ask him to show up? No. Drowned him about at Mamsie like a cat. Suppose people left money laying around where he was. What did he do? He collared it. Suppose he contracted to do a thing and you paid him and he didn't sit down there and see that he done it. What did he do? He always done the other thing. Suppose he opened his mouth. What then? If he didn't shut it up powerful quick, he'd lose a lie every time. That's the kind of a bug Henry was. And if we'd have had him along instead of our kings, he'd have fooled that town a heap worse than ourn done. I don't say that ourn is lambs because they ain't when you come right down to the cold facts, but they ain't nothing to that old ram anyway. All I say is kings is kings and you got to make allowances. Take them all around. They're a mighty ornery lot. It's the way they're raised. Well, this one do smell so like the nation, Huck. Well, they all do, Jim. We can't help the way a king smells. History don't tell no way. Now, the Duke, he's a tall but likely man in some ways. Yes, a Duke's different, but not very different. This one's a middling hard lot for a Duke. When he's drunk, there ain't no nearsighted man could tell him from a king. Well, anyways, I don't hanker for no more, Huck. These is all I can stand. It's the way I feel too, Jim. But we've got them in our hands, and we got to remember what they are and make allowances. Sometimes I wish we could hear of a country that's out of kings. What was the use to tell Jim these weren't real kings and dukes? It wouldn't have done no good, and besides, it was just as I said, you couldn't tell them from the real kind. I went to sleep, and Jim didn't call me when it was my turn. He often done that. When I waked up just at daybreak, he was sitting there with his head down betwixt his knees, moaning and mourning to himself. I didn't take notice nor let on. I know what it was about. He was thinking about his wife and his children away up yonder, and he was low and homesick because he had never been away from home before in his life. And I do believe he cared just as much for his people as white folks does for them, theirn. It don't seem natural, but I reckon it's so. He was often moaning and mourning that way nights when he judged I was asleep and saying, "Po little Elizabeth, po little Johnny, it mighty hard. I spec I ain't ever gonna see you no more, no more." He was a mighty good N-word. Jim was. There's number 9 about Jim's feelings about his family. But this time, I somehow got to talking to him about his wife and young ones. And by and by, he says, "What made me feel so bad this time is because I hear something over yonder on the bank like a whack or a slam a while ago. And it reminded me of the time I treat my little Elizabeth so ornery. She weren't only about 4-year-old, and she took it a scarlet fever and had a powerful rough spell. But she got well. And one day she was standing around, and I says to her, shut the door. Shut the door. She never done it. Just stood there, kind of smiling up at me. It made me mad, and I says it again, mighty loud. I says, "Don't you hear me? Shut the door." She just stood there the same way, kind of smiling up. I was violent. I was angry. I says, I'll make you mind me." And with that, I fetch her a slap the side of the head that sent her a sprawling. Then I went to the other room, and it's gone about 10 minutes. And when I come back, there was that door a-standing open yet, and that child standing most right in it, and looking down at the morning, and the tears running down. But I was mad. I was a-gwine for the child, but just then it was a door that opened inwards, Just then, long come the wind and slam it to behind the child. Kerblam! And my land, the child never moved. My breath most hop out of me, and I feel so I don't know how I feel. I crope out all a trembling and crope around into dough, easy and slow, and poke my head in behind the child, soft and still. And all of a sudden I says, pow! Just as loud as I could yell. She never budged. Oh, Huck, I bust out a crying and grab her up in my arms and say, oh, the poor little thing. The Lord God Almighty forgive poor old Jim, 'cause he never going to forgive himself as long as he's lived. Oh, she was plumb deaf and dumb. Huck, plumb deaf and dumb. And I'd been treating her so. There's answer number 10 and the end of chapter 23. Chapter 24. Next day towards night, we laid up under a little willow towhead out in the middle where there was a village on each side of the river, and the Duke and the King began to lay out a plan for working them towns. Jim, he spoke to the Duke and said he hoped it wouldn't take but a few hours because it got mighty heavy and tiresome to him when he had to lay all day in the wigwam tied with the rope. You see, when we left him all alone, we had to tie him because if anybody happened on him and all by himself and not tied, it wouldn't look much like he was a common N-word, runaway N-word, you know. So the Duke said it was kind of hard to have to lay roped all day, and he'd cipher out some way to get around it. He was uncommon bright, the Duke was, and soon he struck it. He dressed Jim up in a King Lear's outfit. It was a long curtain calico gown and a white horsehair wig and whiskers. And then he took his theater paint and grabbed Jim's face and hands and ears and neck all over a dead, dull, solid blue, like a man's that's been drowned in 9 days. Blamed if he weren't the horriblest looking outrage I ever see. Then the Duke took and wrote out a sign on the shingle. So, sick Arab, but harmless when not out of his head. And he nailed that shingle to a lath and stood the lath up 4 or 5 foot in front of the wigwam. Jim was satisfied. He said it was a sight better than laying tied a couple of years every day and trembling all over every time there was a sound. The Duke told him to make himself free and easy, and if anybody came meddling around, he must hop out of the wigwam and carry on a little and fetch a howl or two like a wild beast. And he reckoned they would light out and leave him alone. He wouldn't wait for him to howl. Why, he didn't only look like he was dead, he looked considerable more than that. There's number 11 about the new plan that makes Jim, he doesn't have to be tied up all night. These rapscallions wanted to try the Nonesuch again, where the king dances around naked and striped, because there was so much money in it, but they judged it wouldn't be safe because maybe the news might have worked along down by this time. They couldn't hit no project that suited exactly, so at last the Duke said he reckoned he'd lay off and work his brains an hour or two and see if he couldn't put up something on the Arkansas village, and the king he allowed he would drop over to the other village without any plan, but just trust in Providence to lead him the profitable way, meaning the devil, I reckon. We all had bought store clothes when we stopped last, and now the king put his on and told me to put mine on. I'd done it, of course. The king's duds was all black, and he did look real swell and starchy. I never knowed how clothes could change a body before. Why, before, he looked like the orneriest old rip that ever was. But now, when he'd take off his new white beaver and make a bow and do a smile, he looked that grand and good and pious that you'd say he'd walked right out of the ark. And maybe it was old Leviticus himself. Jim cleaned up the canoe, and I got my paddle ready. There was a big steamboat laying at the shore, away up under the point, about 3 miles above town. Been there a couple of hours, taking on freight. Says the king, seeing as how I'm dressed, I reckon I may have better arrive from down St. Louis or Cincinnati or some other big place. Go for the steamboat, Huckleberry. We'll come down to the village on her. I didn't have to be ordered twice to go and take a steamboat ride. I fetched the shore a half a mile above the village and then went scooting along the bluff bank in the easy water. Pretty soon we come to a nice, innocent-looking young country Jake sitting on a log, swabbing the sweat off his face, for it was powerful warm weather, and he had a couple of big carpet bags by him. Run her nose and shore, says the king, and I done it. Where are you bound for, young man? For the steamboat going to Orleans. Get aboard, says the king. Hold on a minute, my servant will help you with them bags. Jump out and help the gentleman, Adolphus, meaning me, I see. I done so, and then we all three started on again. The young chap was mighty thankful, said it was tough work toting his baggage in such weather. He asked the king where he was going, and the king told him he'd come down to the river and landed at the other village this morning, and now he was going up a few miles to see an old friend on a farm up there. The young fellow says, when I first see you, I says to myself, it's Mr. Wilkes, sure. He come mighty near to getting here in time. Then I says again, no, I reckon it ain't him, or else he wouldn't be paddling up the river. You ain't him, are you? No, my name is Blodgett, Alexander Blodgett, Reverend Alexander Blodgett. I suppose I must say I'm one of the Lord's poor servants.
But still, I'm just as able to be sorry for Mr. Wilkes not arriving in time all the same, if he's missed anything by it, which I hope he hasn't.
Well, he didn't miss any property by it, because he'll get all that all right, but he's missed seeing his brother Peter die, which he mayn't mind, nobody can tell as to that. But his brother would give anything in this world to see him before he died, never talked about nothing else all these 3 weeks, hadn't seen him since they was boys together, and hadn't ever seen his brother William at all. That's the deaf and dumb one. And even ever seen his brother William, that's the deaf and dumb one. William ain't more than 30 or 35. Peter and George was the only ones that come out here. George was the married brother. Him and his wife both died last year. Harvey and William's the only ones that's left now. And as I was saying, they haven't got here in time.
Did anybody send them word?
Oh, yes, a month or two ago when Peter was first took sick. Because Peter said then that he sort of felt like he weren't going to get well this time. You see, he was pretty old, and George's girls was too young to be much company for him, except Mary Jane, the redheaded one. And so he was kind of lonesome after George and his wife died and didn't seem to care much to live. He most desperately wanted to see Harvey, and William too for that matter, because he was one of them kind that can't bear to make a will. He left a letter behind for Harvey and said that he told in it where his money was hid and how he wanted the rest of the property divided up so George's girls would be all right. For George didn't leave nothing, and that letter was all they could get him to put a pen to.
Why do you reckon Harvey didn't come? Where does he live?
Oh, he lives in England, Sheffield, preaches there, has never been in this country. He hasn't had any too much time. Besides, he mightn't have got the letter at all, you know.
Too bad he couldn't have lived to see his brothers, poor soul. You going to Orleans, you say?
Yes, but that ain't only a part of it. I'm going on a ship next Wednesday for Rio de Janeiro, where my uncle lives, Rio de Janeiro, in Brazil.
It's a pretty long journey, but it'll be lovely. I wish I was a-going. Is Mary Jane the oldest? How old is the others?
Mary Jane's 19, Susan's 15, and Joanna's about 14. That's the one that gives herself the good works and has a hair lip. Hair lip is a birth defect where your lip punches up, is now usually taken care of through surgery in the first world.
Poor things to be left alone in the cold world so.
Well, they could be worse off. Old Peter had friends, and they ain't going to let them come to no harm. There's Hobson and Baptist preacher and Deacon Lott Hobby and Ben Rucker and Abner Shackelford and Levi Bell, the lawyer, and Dr. Robinson and their wives and the widow Bartley. And, well, there's a lot of them, but they're the ones that Peter was thickest with and used to write about sometimes when he wrote home. So Harvey will know where to look for friends when he gets here. Well, the old man, he went on asking questions till he just fairly emptied that young fellow. Blamed if he didn't inquire about everybody and everything in that blessed town, and all about the Wilkses, and about Peter's business, which was a tanner, and about George's, which was a carpenter, and about Harvey's, which was a disinterring minister, and so on, and so on. So here's number 12 about how the king and the duke, they're about to perform this long con for this Wilkes family, trying to get all the money and the inheritance. How do they learn all the stuff that they need to perform this con? It's pretty simple. Then he says, what did you want to walk all the way up to the steamboat for?
Oh, because she's a big Orleans boat, and I was afraid she mightn't stop there. When they're deep, they won't stop for a hail. A Cincinnati boat will, but this is a St. Louis one.
Was Peter Wilkes well off? Oh, yes, pretty well off. He had houses and land, and it's reckoned he left $3,000 or $4,000 in cash hid up somewheres.
When did you say he died?
I didn't say, but it was last night.
Funeral tomorrow, likely?
Yes, about the middle of the day.
Well, it's all terrible sad, but we've all got to go one time or another, so what we want to do is be prepared, then we're all right.
Yes, sir, it's the best way. Ma always used to say that. When we struck the boat, she was about done loading, and pretty soon she got off. The king never said nothing about going aboard, so I lost my ride after all. When the boat was gone, the king made me paddle up another mile to a lonesome place, and then he got ashore and says, now hustle back right off and fetch the duke up here and the new carpetbags. And if he's gone over to the other side, go over there and get him. And tell him to get himself up regardless. Shovel on now. I see what he was up to, but I never said nothing, of course. When I got back with the duke, we hid the canoe and then sat down on a log, and the king told him everything, just like the young fellow had said it, every last word of it. And all the time he was doing it, he tried to talk like an Englishman, and he done it pretty well, too, for a slouch. I can't imitate him, so I am going to try to, but he really done it pretty good. Then he says, how are you on the deaf and dumb, Bilgewater? The Duke said, leave him alone for that. Said he had played a deaf and dumb person on histrionic boards. He played someone who can't speak or hear in a play. So then they waited for a steamboat. Here's number 13. About the middle of the afternoon, a couple of little boats come along, but they didn't come from high enough up the river. But at last there was a big one, and they hailed her. She sent out her yawl, and we went aboard, and she was from Cincinnati. And when they found we only wanted to go 4 or 5 miles, they was booming mad and gave us a cussing. Said they wouldn't land us. But the king was calm. He says,
"If gentlemen can afford to pay $1 a mile apiece to be took on and put off in a yawl, a steamboat can afford to carry them, can't it?"
So they softened down and said it was all right. When we got to the village, they yawled us ashore. About 24 men flocked down when they see the yawl coming. And when the king says,
"Can any of you gentlemen tell me where Mr. Peter Wilkes lives?"
they gave a glance at one another and nodded their heads as much to say, "What did I tell you?" Then one of them, kind of soft and gentle, says,
"I'm sorry, sir, but the best we can do is tell you where he did live yesterday evening."
Sudden as winking, the ornery old creature went all to smash and fell up against the man and put his chin on his shoulder and cried down his back and says,
"Oh, alas, alas, our poor brother gone, and we never got to see him. Oh, it's too hard."
Then he turns around blubbering and makes a lot of idiotic signs to the Duke on his hands and blamed if he didn't drop a carpetbag and bust out a crying. If they weren't the beatenest lot, them two frauds, that I ever struck. Well, the men gathered round and sympathized with them and said all sorts of kind things to them and carried their carpetbags up the hill for them and let them lean on them and cry and told the king all about his brother's last moments. And the king, he told it all over again on his hands to the Duke. And both of them took on about that dead tanner like they'd lost the 12 disciples. Well, if I ever struck anything like it, I'm an N-word. It was enough to make a body ashamed of the human race. There's just number 14 about the scam they're going to pull and how they're acting in front of these people. That's the end of 22 to 24.